It's 3:48 p.m. on May 13, 2023. Within the last 24 hours, I've been reflecting very substantially on events that happened in 2017, January and February 2017, the original Stormy Daniels story. The original story about Stormy Daniels isn't about a stripper. It's about a woman that went to a food service provider that was being administered by a Catholic service organization that had a television screen above the doorway where women and also men, but at different times, had to pass through in order to take a shower. One day on that television screen above that doorway, facing out toward the assemblage, where, by the way, there was a counter where young men, mostly African American men, that looked to be under the age of 20 were volunteering for their Christian service requirements. I understand at least a part involving their curricular requirements as part of their schooling. That day on that television, first there appeared hardcore pornography involving what appeared to be a white woman with dark hair having sex with a white man with curly dark hair. At some point, there was a doorway behind the man. Several African American men burst through that doorway, grabbed the white man off of the white woman, threw him to the side, and then started to take turns having forcible sex with her while she was protesting. This was on the television screen above the doorway where people had to pass through to take a shower. It was also being displayed in the area where we were supposed to get and eat our food after we were subject to a prayer that was led by somebody alleging themselves to be a Christian leader. At that time, there was a man, an African American policeman, who was sitting in a chair at a table. His arms were crossed, his legs were spread open. He was watching the television. I saw it. I said out loud, Do we really have to watch pornography before we're supposed to pray to eat? A bunch of other people that were watching it started laughing. I said it again. The officer stood up and he said, if you don't keep your mouth shut, you're going to get your ass kicked. I looked around to see who heard. There were several young men that were behind a counter that heard. There was also another police officer that was further back from that area using his cell phone. He wasn't African American. Sometime later, I had another encounter with the same officer involving a cup that I was drinking coffee out of. He decided to make a spectacle out of me in front of other men there. And then when I made a remark about the understanding what the cup meant, he banned me from being able to get food there. I went to another food service provider alleged to be associated with the Catholic Church. While I was in line, another African American police officer tried to hold my food ticket right above his crotch. He looked at me and he said, "We know who you are." I didn't quite understand until he put the ticket in front of his crotch. I tried to grab the ticket to go in and get food, but apparently I didn't do it in an obsequious enough a manner. He then pursued me throughout the area, and he assaulted me physically in front of everybody in the cafeteria. There were at least 50 people that were waiting to get food, maybe more. I was looking at people. Excuse me, is anybody going to say anything? They were just laughing. By the time we got through the cafeteria and got to the door in the back of the area, I walked out. He followed me out the door to harass me. I had a bag lunch. As he followed me out the door, I threw the bag lunch at him. Then he ended up pursuing me. He put me to the ground. He put me in handcuffs. And then he brought me back in. Sat me down in a chair, took out his cell phone, and took a picture of me while I was in handcuffs. I said, "Are you going to read me my rights?" He ended up calling another officer. Again, this officer was not African American. He was making jokes with the people about the picture he'd taken on my cell phone. When the other officer came back, when the other officer came, they swapped handcuffs from the handcuffs the African American officer put on me to the handcuffs the other officer put on me before putting me in the back of a car, driving me down the street till still a third Christian service food provider. And he said I could go there next. I tried to file police reports with IAD a second time, by the way. I'd already tried to file a police report against somebody alleging himself to be the chief of police who was soliciting me for prostitution in the basement of the library at what was supposed to be a Christmas event for the homeless. At that time, I got threatened by the person who alleged himself to be an IAD officer. When I went back the second time, there were other IAD officers, presumably taking reports. One of the names of those officers' last names was Daniels. The other officer happened to have a name that was reminiscent of what would be considered a tangible item directly involved in the incidents of concern. I ended up being banned from the second food service provider as well. I tried to return over a month later. The same police officer was there. He yelled at me from across the street, "Hey, you're banned. By the way, I still got your picture on my cell phone." That's the original Stormy Daniels story. In July of 2018, when the story of the imbroglio involving Stormy Daniels allegedly happened, this was more than a year after I had filed the IAD reports and more than a year and a quarter after the incidents had happened. It was because of those incidents I had to leave Houston and seek assistance from outside of Houston, which is what led me to the domestic violence shelter that became the subject of my efforts to petition the Supreme Court of Texas after I'd gone through an appropriate administrative process in order to try to seek relief. When I went to that shelter, they refused to assist me in any way, shape, or form with the acts of, would you call it police brutality? There were a lot of people that saw me get assaulted. Maybe because of what? I only spent an hour and a half afterward in excruciating pain, crying out with witnesses, by the way, after the assault. Was I just not destituted enough at the time for somebody to take it seriously? Or was it a civil rights matter involving the fact that I'm an obnoxious, loud white woman and the police officers of concern were African American men? Honestly, be honest. Because we're over 6 years now. It just so happens that the officer who ended up getting a formal IAD report was not the one named Daniels. I was supposed to meet with a separate IAD officer for that report. He never contacted me back. I did file a formal IAD report on the other officer. I also let a senator of Texas know about what happened, and I provided documentation about the specific charges. Why? Because I was in Houston being threatened, including getting threatened for getting my ass kicked. Because cops wanted to watch hardcore pornography at a Catholic food service provider where women were going to take a shower. At the beginning of the United States, President George Washington asked members of his cabinet to write a formal review of a piece of legislation that was then pending regarding the Bank of the United States. At the time, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson wrote his review, alleging it was unconstitutional on a number of grounds. One of the grounds he alleged was unconstitutional about this legislation was that it violated the laws of Mort, Maine. What is Mort, Maine? According to Barron's Law Dictionary, Mort, Maine, literally, dead hand, applies to real property that, from the nature of the purposes to which it is devoted, or the character of the ownership to which it is subjected, it is for every practical purpose in a dead or unserviceable hand. At common law, it was used to refer to land where the alienability was restricted because it was owned by an ecclesiastical or temporal corporation. In England, the Mortmain Acts restricted the transfer of property to corporations in response to the use of corporations by the church and other ecclesiastical bodies to control land. The concept has been used with reference to any sort of corporation that may hold property in perpetuity, and thus with a dead hand. Here's the problem. In the 1996 Anti-Terrorist and Effective Death Penalty Act, the currently existing, at the time, anti-money laundering statute was modified to include other offenses, including threatening or intending to deliver on the murder of a family member of a law enforcement officer or a member of government, aiding or obstructing or threatening the life of an investigator of crime, or trafficking in radioactive materials. All of those were added to the anti-money laundering statute as capital offenses. Now, I imagine that also includes if a member of law enforcement threatens the family member of another member of law enforcement, or a government official threatens the family member of another government official. But here's the problem. It also discussed and was applied in manners that penalized alleged religious organizations for acts of money laundering. You mean like charities? How many Christian charities have been tried for acts of money laundering under the 1996 Anti-Terrorist and Effective Death Penalty Act? Was the effective death penalty conceived of and applied in order to consecrate dead hands and to remand people that were political dissenters as some sort of ecclesiastical property? And is that the justification for subjecting people to acts of religious persecution in order to politically disappear them and to try to require them to comport themselves in a manner where they're supposed to what? Donate to Christian charities, including to prove they're not Jews? Again, who was the original sponsor of the 1996 Anti-Terrorist and Effective Death Penalty Act? My understanding is until the election of Joseph Biden, it was identified on the congressional website, the electronic records of Congress, the official government records of Congress, that the original proposal for the 1996 Anti-Terrorist and Effective Death Penalty Act was proposed the session before by Senator Charles Schumer. It did not pass, but it had a number of co-sponsors. It was re-sponsored and resubmitted the next term and sponsored by Senator Joseph Biden with different co-sponsors and was passed that year. Right after Joseph Biden became alleged president, somehow the authorship of that bill changed to mean Senator Bob Dole. Unfortunately, at least allegedly, Senator Bob Dole is no longer alive. Or is he? Or is he just a dead hand? This is completely unconscionable and unjustified in every single manner. You are not allowed to do this. And you are also not allowed to say that this is part of some Masonic ritual performance, and so it's covered by the First Amendment. It is not. Are members of Congress and the Senate, as well as the President, abusing the laws of Mort Maine and trying to subject political dissenters to religious persecution in order to subject them to acts of slavery under and through alleged nonprofit organizations operating out of alleged Christian organizations and institutions? For the record, I consider that to be completely unchristian, but it's also unconstitutional and it's a capital offense.